How can a country rich in gold, fertile land, and valuable crops remain one of the poorest in the world? For decades, experts searched for answers in politics, foreign aid, and natural resources. But what if they were all looking in the wrong place? What if the greatest wealth of a nation doesn't disappear through corruption or conflict, but quietly leaves every single day inside ships, trucks, and cargo containers? That is the question Burkina Faso is trying to answer. And the answer is leading the country down a path few expected, one that challenges decades of economic thinking. If they're right, this story isn't just about Burkina Faso. It could change the way we think about prosperity itself. The answer is both surprisingly simple and incredibly ambitious. Burkina Faso has announced plans to build 500 local processing factories across the country, not to produce more raw materials, but to transform them before they ever leave its borders. For generations, cotton was exported to be turned into clothing somewhere else. Mangoes became juice in another country. Sesame created jobs for someone else's economy. Burkina Faso wants to change that equation. Supporters call it one of the boldest industrial strategies in the country's modern history. Critics question whether such an ambitious vision can succeed against challenges like limited infrastructure, electricity shortages, and security concerns. So why take such a risk? Because everything begins with one simple idea. Value should be created at home. Every harvest season, thousands of mangoes are picked from orchards across Burkina Faso. Some are sold in local markets, but many begin a much longer journey. Loaded onto trucks, they travel hundreds of miles before reaching ports. From there, they are shipped overseas, where they are washed, sliced, packaged, branded, and sold at prices far higher than the farmers who grew them will ever receive. The mango changed, the value changed, but the country where it was grown did not. The same story has repeated itself for cotton, sesame, cashews, tomatoes, and countless other raw materials. Burkina Faso has never lacked resources. It has lacked something far more valuable: the ability to transform those resources before they leave. For decades, this pattern shaped the country's economy. Farmers did the growing. Other countries did the processing. Factories were built elsewhere. Jobs were created elsewhere. Profits stayed elsewhere. Each shipment carried more than agricultural products. It carried away opportunities that would never return. This wasn't unique to Burkina Faso. Many developing nations have followed the same economic path for generations, exporting raw materials while importing back-finished products at much higher prices. It became so common that many people stopped questioning whether there was another way. But eventually, one question became impossible to ignore. Why should the most valuable part of the journey always happen somewhere else? That question spread far beyond government offices. It reached entrepreneurs, engineers, students, factory owners, mechanics. People who looked at the same truckloads of raw materials and saw something entirely different. Not exports, possibilities. And once enough people begin asking the same question, the future has a way of changing direction. One of those people was Salif. Every morning, before the streets of Bobo Dioulasso were fully awake, he unlocked the doors to his small workshop. The smell of oil and hot metal filled the air as another day of repairing imported machines began. For years, this had been his life. A broken engine, a worn-out gearbox, a replacement part ordered from another country. Again and again. The machines kept arriving. The spare parts kept arriving. Even many of the products they were used to process had once begun their journey in Burkina Faso. That irony never left him. He often watched trucks loaded with raw cotton and fresh mangoes rumble past his workshop, heading toward distant ports. Weeks later, finished products would return, packaged, branded, far more expensive. Someone else had transformed what his country had grown. Someone else had created the jobs. Someone else had earned the biggest profits. One afternoon, Salif asked a question that sounded almost too simple. Why can't we do this here? It wasn't an economist's question. It wasn't a politician's question. It was a mechanic's question. But sometimes, history begins with ordinary people asking ordinary questions that no one had taken seriously before. As conversations like this spread, from workshops to classrooms, from farmers to entrepreneurs, the idea slowly gained momentum. Perhaps Burkina Faso didn't need to produce more. Perhaps it needed to produce more value. That single shift in thinking would eventually inspire one of the country's most ambitious industrial visions. But imagining hundreds of factories was the easy part. Building them would be something else entirely. For the first time in years, people like Salif could imagine a different future. Not because everything had changed overnight, but because the question had changed. Instead of asking what Burkina Faso could sell, more people were asking what Burkina Faso could build. That shift in thinking began reaching places few expected. Engineering students started talking about manufacturing instead of leaving the country for opportunities abroad. Young entrepreneurs began exploring businesses that could process local products instead of simply trading them. Farmers who had spent decades selling raw harvests started wondering what those same harvests might be worth if they were transformed closer to home. The idea was spreading, and ideas can be powerful. But ideas alone cannot keep machines running. Reality arrived the moment people tried to turn vision into production. Factories need electricity. Machines need maintenance. Production lines need skilled workers. Raw materials need reliable roads. Businesses need financing. Investors need confidence. None of those things can be created overnight. Every challenge seemed connected to another. When electricity failed, production stopped. When production stopped, costs increased. When costs increased, investors hesitated. And when investment slowed, progress became even harder. Some critics looked at these obstacles and reached a simple conclusion. The plan was too ambitious, too expensive, too risky. Perhaps Burkina Faso should continue doing what it had always done. Export the raw materials. Let someone else handle the rest. To many people, that sounded like the safer choice. But history has rarely been written by people who chose the safest path. At first, the debate seemed to be about factories. Could Burkina Faso really build them? Could investors be convinced? Could the country overcome decades of economic and infrastructure challenges? Those were important questions, but they were not the most important one. The real question was far more uncomfortable. What would happen if nothing changed? What if another generation of farmers continued exporting raw cotton while someone else turned it into clothing? What if another generation of young engineers left home because the industries they dreamed of working in never existed? What if another generation of entrepreneurs spent their lives importing products that could have been made just a few miles away? Doing nothing also had a cost. It was simply a cost that rarely appeared in government budgets or economic reports. It was measured in opportunities never created, skills never developed, businesses never started, dreams quietly abandoned before they had the chance to become reality. Suddenly, the conversation was no longer about whether building factories was expensive. The conversation became whether not building them was even more expensive. That changed everything. Because every nation eventually reaches a moment when maintaining the familiar feels safer than embracing the uncertain. history suggests something different. The countries that transformed their economies were rarely those that waited for perfect conditions. More often, they were the ones willing to begin while conditions were still imperfect. Burkina Faso now stood at that same crossroads. Not guaranteed success, not guaranteed failure, just a choice. To continue exporting raw materials, or to begin exporting something entirely different. Value. Slowly, almost quietly, the first signs of change began to appear. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough for people to notice. In communities where raw harvests had always disappeared onto trucks heading overseas, small processing facilities began appearing closer to the fields. Instead of watching every mango leave untouched, some were cleaned, sorted, dried, or processed before beginning their journey. Cotton no longer represented only a harvest. It represented the possibility of a textile industry. Sesame was no longer just another export. It became the beginning of a longer value chain. For people like Salif, these changes meant something deeply personal. Machines that once arrived only from abroad now required local hands to install, maintain, and improve. Young apprentices gathered around equipment they had previously seen only in textbooks or online videos. Every repaired machine became another lesson. Every operating production line became another classroom. Knowledge was no longer something that had to be imported. It was beginning to take root at home. The transformation was still fragile. No one believed hundreds of factories would appear overnight, but something far more important than concrete buildings was already being constructed. Confidence. The confidence that local engineers could solve local problems, that local businesses could create products capable of competing beyond their own borders, that the next generation might not have to leave home to build meaningful careers. For the first time in decades, possibility no longer felt like an abstract idea. People could finally see it, touch it, work inside it. Yet the greatest challenge was still waiting. Because building a factory is difficult, keeping it alive is even harder. History offers no shortage of ambitious industrial dreams. Around the world, governments have announced grand development plans that never moved beyond paper. Factories were proposed, budgets were approved, groundbreaking ceremonies were celebrated, and then, nothing. Burkina Faso knew that announcing a vision was the easiest part. The real test would come years later, when headlines faded and daily work remained. Would machines still be running? Would workers still have jobs? Would products carrying the words, "Made in Burkina Faso," earn the trust of customers at home and abroad? These questions could not be answered by speeches, only by time. That is why the success of this vision depends on far more than buildings. It depends on teachers willing to train future engineers, farmers willing to embrace new partnerships, entrepreneurs willing to take risks, investors willing to think beyond short-term uncertainty, and ordinary workers like Salif, who return every morning believing that each repaired machine is one small step toward a different future. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside this story. Nations are not transformed by factories alone. They are transformed by millions of ordinary decisions made by ordinary people who choose to build instead of wait. And that realization changes everything. Because by now, it becomes clear. This story was never heading where we thought it was. By now, it might seem that this story is about factories, about production lines, about cotton, about mangoes, about industrial policy. But that isn't what this story has really been about. Not even close. Factories are made of steel, machines, concrete, They can be built, expanded, even abandoned. History is full of factories that once promised prosperity, but now stand empty. So if this story were only about buildings, it wouldn't matter very much. The real story began long before the first factory was ever planned. It began the moment a different question was asked. Not, how much can we export? But, what are we capable of creating ourselves? That question changes everything. Because the greatest barrier facing many developing nations has never been a lack of natural resources, and it has never been a lack of hard-working people. Sometimes, the greatest barrier is believing that the most valuable work will always happen somewhere else. That someone else will design, someone else will manufacture, someone else will innovate, while your role is simply to supply what lies beneath your soil. For generations, that belief quietly shaped economies across much of the developing world. It influenced decisions, education, investment, even imagination. And perhaps that is the most dangerous export of all. Not cotton, not gold, not mangoes, but confidence. The confidence that slowly leaves when a nation begins believing that value must always be created somewhere else. That is why this story is larger than Burkina Faso. Because every country eventually faces the same invisible choice: to define itself by what it owns, or by what it is capable of becoming. Factories alone cannot answer that question. Neither can governments, or speeches, or economic plans. Only people can. People like Salif. Students who choose to become engineers instead of giving up. Farmers who see more than another harvest. Entrepreneurs willing to risk building something that has never existed before. These people are not simply constructing factories. They are rebuilding confidence. And perhaps that is the first thing every nation must manufacture before it can manufacture anything else. In the end, the most important shipment leaving Burkina Faso was never cotton. It was never mangoes. It was never gold. For years, what quietly crossed its borders was something far more difficult to measure. Opportunity, confidence, the belief that the most valuable work would always be done somewhere else. Today, Burkina Faso is trying to bring those things home. Not with promises, not with speeches, but one workshop, one factory, one engineer, one farmer, and one ordinary citizen at a time. No one knows whether every factory will succeed. History offers no such guarantees, but history has always rewarded the nations that dared to believe they could build more than they inherited. Perhaps that is the real lesson hidden inside this story. Prosperity does not begin when a country discovers more resources. It begins the moment its people stop asking, "What can we sell?" and begin asking, "What can we create?" Because the future is rarely imported. It is built, one decision at a time. Before you leave, we'd love to hear your answer to one question. What is one resource your country has that could create far more value if it stayed home? Tell us in the comments. Because some of the most meaningful conversations don't begin in government offices. They begin between ordinary people, asking extraordinary questions. And if you enjoy documentaries that go beyond the headlines to explore the ideas shaping our world, we'd be honored to have you join us on the next journey.